So now we are going into our final session where we have an interview with Jeff Kripal, whose name has come up a number of times already. And then we'll have some time for questions, and we're aiming to finish in an hour, but we might go a little bit over depending on how things are going and if people want to continue. Recent book is called The Flip, about which he spoke to us on our webinar platform. So members are able to access that as the beginning of 7th of October, I think it was. And so he's the chair of religious and philosophy and religious thought at Rice University, but also has a close connection with the Center for Theory and Research at the Esalen Institute. What he's also got coming up, which we will be actively promoting, is he's got a chapter in a new book which is coming out in May called Consciousness Unbound. And this is the 3rd volume of what will be a trilogy, where the original volume was Irreducible Mind, the second one Beyond Physicalism, and this is the 3rd volume. And he's written a brilliant account of how his thesis works and in relation to the arts, and how we need to reinvent the human in the arts. And this forms the basis of the strand 2, the humanities strand, in the new proposal, new phase of the Galileo Commission. So Mark, I'm going to hand over to you to start the process off. Because no, John, we can't take any more questions at the moment. We're taking them later. Unless you were just saying cheers with your teacup, your cup of tea. Mark, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, David. Jeff, I know you're there somewhere. Perhaps you'd just like to say hello so that we can see your face.
Hi, Mark. Hi, David. Hi, everyone.
Hi, Jeff.
Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Now, look, I know you've talked probably to some of the gathering about your notion of the flip, which David just mentioned. But I wonder whether we could link it to what was just being talked about a bit, which is your sense of sort of where we are now. You know, your book, The Flip, has been published by Penguin here in the UK, a mass market paperback book. Do you sense this is becoming a mass phenomenon, or at least interest?
I know the answer people want to hear is yes, but I'm not so sure. You know, I work in the academy. I sort of work behind enemy lines, as it were. And I'm just very, very aware of the sort of massive troops that are, you know, poised against this kind of view. I do think things are shifting, but I think they're shifting slowly. And I think the sciences are shifting primarily because of what they're failing to do, not always because of what they're doing. In other words, they're running up against walls that don't make any sense in a materialist paradigm, but make a paradigm. So I think, you know, there's a kind of conclusion there that serves this worldview, but anything in the near future or establishing such a worldview. And I mean, hopefully we can talk about this later. It feeds into things Will and Jules said a few minutes ago. I do think there's something essentially esoteric or elitist about these ideas. And I don't mean that negatively. I mean that quite positively, but I think we do a disservice to ourselves if we don't struggle with that.
Yeah, well, look, maybe we could pick that up, because that is one of the thoughts which I had as well. And look, let me put it like this, that Dante, a spiritual elite if ever there was one, you know, one of the greatest works of Western literature, talking about many of the things we're touching on today. And yet the middle chunk of his great work is him on Mount Purgatory, having to wrestle with his pride, having to wrestle with his envy, having to wrestle with his greed, his lust. Maybe we need a bit more of that in these discussions. I think it's related to the topological element, which we were talking about this morning.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if we need purgatory or not. I mean, that takes us back a few centuries. I think we need humility here, but I also think we need to recognize that some of these ideas and certainly these experiences are not shared by most people. Let me give you a very contemporary political analog, and I don't mean to get political here. I'm not normally political in these conversations, but a lot of my colleagues in the American universities were deeply, deeply horrified over the last 4 years for reasons I won't go into. And I found that puzzling, frankly. I found it puzzling that they thought that American public culture thought and felt like they did. These are people with PhDs who are some of the most elite individuals in this particular culture. And I grew up in the Midwest. I grew up with farmers. I grew up with small business owners. And I know how they think, and they don't think like we do. And they don't see the world like academics. And so I found the last 4 years equally troubling, but hardly surprising. And so that's, I guess, what I'm trying to get at, is once you recognize the rarity and the specialness of these experiences, you no longer feel this need to have everybody suddenly agree with you and be living in a different culture or worldview. I don't see that happening, but I don't think it's for any sinister reasons. I think people are just being really honest and sincere about what they don't see and don't experience.
Mark, can I just come in here? Because the one of the things I don't entirely agree with what you've just said, Jeff, because the findings of the Alistair Hardy Research Centre in the UK, David Hayes' work, indicate that in the general public, about 2/3 of people have had some sort of spiritual experience. It might not be a flip, but it's much more widespread than is generally acknowledged. But what I wanted to segue into was a thought that I had yesterday from a presentation that I was assessing from the Aleph Trust on the sort of spectrum of, you might call it, or what they called believers, skeptics, and deniers. And I like this distinction between a skeptic and a denier, and it's more accurate. But what struck me is that when what the skeptics are always trying to do is to say, does psi exist? And that seems to me a nonsense question to ask, because if you look at the range of experiences that have been reported, near-death, I mean, you name it, the millions of experiences of the last 100 years, documented experiences. And then for the people who had the experiences, this extended mind, this whatever, however you like to put it, no, they know it, they experienced it, they know it. And so the proper question seemed to me to be, can one reproduce psi in the laboratory? It's not as if in laboratory conditions, you can't prove that psi doesn't exist. You shouldn't, it's not the appropriate question. And so it struck me that there's this very interesting segue between what used to be called psychical research based on experiences and making sense of these experiences, which also applies to the near-death experience literature, and the parapsychological experiments trying to do reproducible work in the lab. And both are considered impossible, by the deniers. And what your thoughts are about this transition between the so-called anecdotal and the laboratory aspect.
Well, first of all, I don't like the word anecdotal for the same reasons.
No, nor do I. I put it in.
Listen, I share completely. I share completely your sense that these experiences are much more common than we recognize. But my point is that elite intellectuals, certainly of American culture, and I imagine of British culture, don't allow them to seep up into the public conversation. They keep them stuffed down with various rhetorical strategies that are essentially debunking essentially gaslighting, as we call it today in the US, is what's happening. So I think these things are more common than we think, but they don't move up into the public conversation. And as a consequence, what we lack is a theory of mind and matter, a worldview, essentially, to make these things plausible. We have all of these stories, which are essentially true and sincere, but we lack a public worldview in which those stories can fit. And what happens is a lot of these stories get filtered up into particular religious worldviews that are in conflict with one another. And so you create these sort of islands of dogmatism or certainty, which self-contradict and create this sort of battle, and that ends up dismissing these experiences further. So I think this kind of third space that Myers and your group is trying to create is still extremely rare, frankly. You get the debunking community or you get the believing community, but you don't really get this third space in the public, at least, that can create this new worldview. And I understand that I'm not a bummer here, David. I'm not trying to dissuade or bum you out. I'm just trying to give you an accurate description of what I'm seeing from the American Academy. I can't go to my provost tomorrow and say, hey, I think we should hire a parapsychologist. I would get laughed out of the room, right? I don't think you could do that in any university.
Well, when the Kessler chair was being, first being offered to universities, there were a number of universities who went out of their way to avoid getting it.
Yeah, right.
And that included Cambridge and London, City University. Edinburgh got it eventually, and also Swansea. They did their best to throw it out as well. Mark, I'll let things go back to you.
Yeah, so I wonder about the role of the humanities in this then. If, it's hard to reproduce in the lab, and, maybe inevitably so, because often these experiences are during emotionally intense times, so you wouldn't get it through the ethics committee anyway. What about the humanities in this, which is one of the main thrusts of your book?
Yeah, so that's where I sit, Mark, and that's what I want to speak about the most. I'm not a scientist and I can't speak for them. But the humanities over the last 40 or 50 years have really followed this kind of scientific materialism and have essentially reduced subjectivity and agency into nothing, essentially. The main moves in the humanities have been to deny human agency and to deconstruct subjectivity into historical processes and constructs of various sorts. So I think the humanities is a real problem, and I think they're essentially burying themselves, making themselves irrelevant, because the kinds of truths that humanists are really articulating, very persuasively, by the way, are all depressing. And we lack a positive or optimistic kind of message in the humanities. And so that's where I've placed my focus, is on the humanities and trying to get them to say things that are optimistic or positive and not just critical or deconstructive. I don't think we should abandon that, but we should offer this other, more ecstatic or cosmopathic side of things, to quote an earlier conversation. No, we can't do that, Mark. Nobody will do that. Nobody will be cosmopathic today in the academy. And if you do that, good luck. You're probably not going to get away with it. You're going to get beat down. So that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. Again, what I'm trying to say is, can't we accept our own radicalism vis-a-vis the public culture? Can't we accept the fact that we're essentially offering an esoteric worldview here and own it as such? And stop expecting everybody to suddenly sign on to our own convictions, which in fact I think are true, but I don't expect the Midwest to suddenly wake up to the fact tomorrow that consciousness is primary. They wouldn't even know what I was talking about.
No, that's I'd just like to raise another question there vis-a-vis the Academy. This is a great book that came out in 2006, and we gave it the Network Book Prize. It's called Extraordinary Knowing, Science, Skepticism, and the Inexplicable Powers of the Human Mind by Elizabeth Lloyd Meyer. And she's not the only person to make this observation, but I would guess that your colleagues, and even in the Dean's Department, have all had interesting, expansive experiences, but because of the climate in which we live, they wouldn't dare talk about them, and they would assume that everybody else would laugh at them if they actually admitted that they had. So we've got this real problem of a gap between people's private experience and their fear of publicly losing their reputation in research because of this kind of epistemological police force which is out there, saying that you can only think in a certain way. So do you see, what could we do to enable people to come out in this respect?
Well, yeah, so David, that's what I've set to do for the last 15 years. And the method I've sort of landed on, not consciously or, kind of accidentally landed on, is you just walk into a group of really smart people and you start talking about these things in a smart way. And they come out of the closet and they say, let me tell you this story, or let me tell you what happened to my mother, or let me tell you what happened to me. And they become comfortable talking about those things because they realize that you can talk about them without sounding like the tabloids. That's the fear right there. That's the fear that intellectuals have. If I say these things, I will look foolish. But if we walk in as authors or poets or writers and we give them a language to talk about these things that's smart and persuasive and powerful, then they'll do it. At least more of them will do it. Some of them still won't do it, by the way, for reasons that are mysterious to me. But people are essentially conservative. They like their status. They don't want to do anything to challenge that. They're essentially status quo. So I think, again, we're up against that, but I think it can be done.
Well, it's where you've got the what we call in the sort of network board conversations we've had with the respectable and the acceptable. So the acceptable is respectable and the respectable is acceptable. And just people lack moral courage, at one level. But I just want to, sorry, Mark, if you were coming in, but I just want, Jules Evans has asked a very interesting question in the chat here. He wonders if psychedelic therapy might change this, what we're talking about. And Huxley, whose book is on the shelf behind, he thinks, probably is, thought psychedelics could provide a mysticism for the masses, although he later wondered if they could only really work for the few. What's your view on that question?
So it's a great question. So actually, Huxley disagreed profoundly with Tim Leary. Tim Leary and Aldous Huxley were dear friends, but they profoundly disagreed on this very point. Huxley concluded that these were extremely powerful molecules and should be restricted to intellectuals and scientists and artists and be used in very, very carefully controlled circumstances. Leary, of course, was of the opinion of, put it in the water, get it out on the street, give it to everyone. And Aldous was like, Tim, if you do that, there will be a legal backlash and we will be in jail. And of course, that's exactly what happened. So now with this kind of renaissance of psychedelic research and this legalization of a lot of these plants and molecules, different situation. But I think we have to be very careful here because pharmaceutical companies are there to make money. They're not there to change the world. And once we start medicalizing mysticism, literally, with these pharmaceuticals that are now legal, I think we're going to introduce a whole nother set of moral questions that I'm not against. I think, great, let's go for it. But I just think we have to be thoughtful. And also, I think I've seen done today, which is confront the dark side, confront the complexity. A lot of psychedelic experience is not pretty, folks. Mental illness and mystical states are connected. A lot of magic historically has been designed to harm and to hurt and to go to war and to kill things. With the whole spectrum of this human experience, so it's just this, straight and narrow path through the middle.
Ward said in Cambridge at a meeting that Bernard Carr organized he was dangerous. He said, no, it's not religions that are dangerous, it's human beings who are dangerous, which sort of backs up what you've been saying. Mark, where would you like to?
Yeah, so not unrelatedly, actually, another area of your work, Jeff, which I find very fascinating, partly because I'm a psychotherapist, is, I don't know if you use this word quite, but I think of it as the reflexive element here. And perhaps this touches on what we were just talking about, that these experiences aren't like Newton's second law of motion, you push and that happens. They happen in living, dynamic, often ill-understood psyches. And so, as I think you have put it actually, often it's not the content that matters so much, it's where it takes you next. And so perhaps we also need to think about these experiences in different ways, not just sort of banging our heads trying to prove something, which is a very reductive approach, but perhaps with a combination of people like Elizabeth Myers, who's a psychoanalyst, the humanities, start getting a bit more nuanced and subtle about our experience, which, surely we need anyway.
Yeah, so the origins of my interest in these things is actually sitting in a room in Big Sur for about 10 years, listening to physicists, including Bernard, by the way, and neuroscientists and philosophers of science talk about these things. And I was always kind of the weird humanist in the corner saying, folks, I don't think you're going to find a mechanism. Because I don't think that's what these things are about. I think they're about meaning. And meaning is not a scientific category. It's a humanistic category. But if you actually look closely at these experiences in people's lives, what you realize very quickly is they're about creating meaning. They're about giving consolation. They're about connecting loved ones. They're about trauma. They're about really human things. They're not about cause and effect. They're just not. And that doesn't mean there's not some causal network there, or there isn't some biological mechanism at work. But I think it distracts us down this scientific path where the real core of these things is much more in the realm of meaning and story and what's happening to this human being at this moment in time, or what's happening to this culture. I think that's another big question.
Yeah, and so Angela in the chat mentioned the theme of death. One of my great disappointments this year with the COVID crisis is that we haven't had a three-dimensional, let alone four-dimensional discussion about death. This great confrontation with death that different cultures have faced. And certainly in Europe, as far as I've seen it, and I guess in the US as well, could this be a moment when the question of meaning in relation to death might be called up?
So Shahida Bari of the BBC interviewed me after The Flip came out in May, and she asked me what I thought was I knew where the question was coming from, but it wasn't related to the book. It was, what does this have to do with COVID? And of course, I wrote that book in 2018, so technically it has nothing to do with COVID. But what I said to Shahida, and I'll say here again, is I'm like, look, hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions of people, are dying from this virus, but millions of them are also not dying. And they're coming back from these near encounters with death, I am certain, with all kinds of near-death experiences and all kinds of anomalous states. And you know what? We're not going to hear about them. Because if they try to talk about them, they're going to be framed as, we're going to use some kind of pathological language, some kind of psychiatric language. They're going to be on drugs. They're going to be manic. They're going to be delusional. We're going to immediately frame those encounters in ways that our public culture can assimilate. And I still think that. I suspect very strongly there's people having these experiences every single day, and these are precisely what we're not hearing about on the news.
Yeah, thank you very much. So just nudging things slightly again, and with your Esalen hat on perhaps to some degree, I wonder also too about another, a thing that really is happening big in the popular culture, which seems to be, for want of a better way of putting it, a meeting of East and West. in practices like meditation, of course. There's a history to this, going back into the 19th century and then before. And I think you've noted that it's often been when East meet West that new perceptions, new shifts of consciousness even occur, you know, whether it be shamanism and Platonism, or the evidence that Buddhism and ancient skepticism might be connected, and more recently existentialism and Gnosticism, you know, even abstract art and theosophy, which actually is a bit of an untold story. What do you make of all that? Do you see that of relevance to our now?
Yeah, absolutely. This kind of, for me, this takes, I think one of the most interesting moments of this, actually, which we don't really understand yet, it takes us back to the Myers conversation. You know, Myers was just opening up to Buddhism, actually, and he was starting to think about evolution, and in a Darwinian or a non-Darwinian sense, much more along the lines of Wallace than Darwin, frankly. But this is the moment in European history in which evolution and reincarnation get matched. You know, we, believe it or not, before that, we don't find this. You know, I mean, there is a kind of progressive element to reincarnation models in Asian religions, but they really link up with Darwinism in the late 19th century, particularly in England, particularly in theosophy, by the way. And then they kind of explode into this kind of all these evolutionary spiritualities that Will and Jules were talking about. And I don't think we really understand that yet. And I think one of the figures here that we really have to struggle and understand, and has not been mentioned today, is Frederick Nietzsche. I mean, the Übermensch, the superhuman or the Superman, was directly linked to a non-Darwinian biology in Nietzsche. And you have that elitism, you have that scary authoritarianism there. You have Nietzsche's thought picked up in 1,000 different ways by 100 different cultures. And it's just seeped into all of these discussions in ways that I think are not very well known or conscious. And so I think we have to go back and we start having to recover these writers, not to divinize or absolutize any one of them, but to kind of understand where we're getting these ideas.
Yeah, it can become quite a surprise to people to learn how, say, influential Nietzsche was on Jung. Two names that don't come together in the popular imagination very much, but are very connected, in fact. I also very much interested in your comment there about East meets West and reincarnation and evolution, because a great inspiration of mine, Owen Barfield, who we partly kicked off the day with, he felt that would be one of the key meeting grounds as East came West, was how certainly Western, Judeo-Christian, Islamic even traditions could cope with reincarnation. But he thought there would be a crossover, because he also thought that what the West understands is the importance of the individual, and how the individual I am relates to the divine I am. Yeah. And he thought that would, as it were, have to somehow be passed back. And that there'd be some sort of synthesis that would come out as a result. Yeah. You're nodding. Does that make some sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I just don't think we're there yet, Mark. I just think we're in the midst of this new story, or these new sets of stories that are forming. And it's confusing to us because we still, in some sense, believe in the older stories, but we see the plausibility of the newer stories on the horizon, and they're just all kind of mixing together, and we're kind of caught in the middle.
So what's the task then? Is the task to try and track, or kind of, as my friend Rupert Sheldrake would say, to create a natural history of what's going on and be a bit Aristotelian about it, try and understand?
I mean, if you're asking me personally, I think the first thing we can do is not land. You know, I often say I don't believe in belief. It isn't that I'm against belief or that I'm somehow an atheist. I mean, once you believe in a particular religious system or a dogma or a doctrine, you've landed and you've shut off all these other possibilities. And so I think for at least some people, not everyone, again, I'm not talking about the public, I think this is a very elite very esoteric project we're talking about. I think for some people, they should not land, and they should try to tease out all of these things, both historically, but also biographically and personally and experientially, and not assume that where we're going is where we've been. I think that's, you know, when people ask me for advice, I'm not an advice giver. I'm not a prophet. I'm not a religious leader. But if I have one piece of advice, it's turn around. Stop looking to the past, or look to the past for inspiration, but turn around and look to the future for some truth that isn't even appearing yet. You don't even know what it is. And I doubt very much it's scientific or frankly spiritual. It's going to be something else that we don't even have a word for yet. And so that's kind of my one piece of advice is turn around. This is kind of a temporal flip from the past to the future.
Which is the literal meaning of revolution.
Yeah.
I wonder if Jules would like to come in here. He's been putting quite a bit into the chat. Jules, would you like to make
a very nourishing conversation and interview. I mean, just on Jeffrey's point on Nietzsche and Nietzsche's influence on evolutionary spirituality and New Age spirituality, definitely something I've been very much looking at. The magazine, The New Age, which coined the phrase in the 1880s, was a big transmitter for Nietzsche.
Oh, really?
Yeah, into English culture in the 1880s. A.R. Orridge, who then went on and became a follower of Gurdjieff. And he was a big transmitter of Nietzsche. I think the key point about that is what a lot of progressive spiritual people in the 1880s took from Nietzsche, along with the idea of the Superman, was a disdain for compassion and charity, and a rejection of Victorian Christianity and philanthropism, and this idea you need to be hard and therefore have kind of no pity for the evolutionarily backward. And that was a dangerous strain that came into 20th century spirituality.
Yeah, Jules, that's why, of course, I love the humanities, is you can engage a figure like Nietzsche without being Nietzschean, right? It's not that you pretend that the person was right about everything, but you have to struggle with this person. And you know better than anyone, my favorite American mythology here is the X-Men. And the reason I love that mythology is it struggles with the Übermensch. You know, if you know that mythology, you know that Magneto is the Übermensch. He represents exactly that view which you're describing of no compassion, being hard. The mutants are here to take over the earth, screw the humans, basically. But then you have this other figure, this other Professor Xavier, who's much more the kind of liberal humanist, and who's like, no, that is not the answer. That is not going to get us to where we want to go. We need compassion. We need to be one species. We need to be, humans as well. And so this mythology battles Nietzsche out, actually, in public without ever mentioning him, right? And I know there are other mythologies and other literary figures that are doing the same thing. And that's what I think we should be doing, is trying to struggle with these ideas and these moralities, as Nietzsche would say. These are different moralities.
Yeah, and the idea of the Superman, I think the people who created Superman, their first one of their inspirations was Nietzsche. I think the idea of the
but ironically they were two Cleveland Jewish kids. Yeah. And Superman in the U.S. was essentially a Jewish immigrant. He was the alien, right? The alien who was trying to pose as an ordinary Midwestern. Nietzsche gets picked up by the Nazis, of course, and becomes anti-Semitic, but he himself wasn't anti-Semitic, and he gets picked up in all kinds of ways.
I was just wondering if William would like to come in as well at this point, whether he's got some brewing thoughts on our conversation.
Yes, and it's something that we'll chime with Jules, because Jules and I have talked about this, and I know that Jules talked about it with other people, including Rupert Sheldrake, and that's about looking at Aldous Huxley. And clearly, both with his work with psychedelics, with mescaline, and then with acid, but also his later essays that he was publishing around 1960, 1961, they quite clearly indicate the sense that humans humanity is A, overpopulated, which is a problem for Huxley on a massive scale, but secondly, that because of this overpopulation and this declining education, we are devolving, we are unraveling, our process of evolution is somehow ground to a halt, and people, and he actually mentions in one of his essays, sorry, it's actually downstairs, so I haven't gone to get the book itself of essays, but he does mention about people's IQ is collectively going down. I have no idea what data he was using to establish this, nor why IQ should be an indication of evolutionary progress or regress. But again, what you have there is you have this slightly uncomfortable area, and this is something that Jules, you talked about with Rupert, with Sheldrake, about Julian Huxley. But you have that slightly uncomfortable area there of elitism, which is then translated into that sense of there are certain people who are destined through their breeding, through their education, through perhaps their race and ethnicity, but this is a very, very contentious area, of course. There are certain people who are kind of better equipped to lead this transformation. And I think this is really, really damaging. And I think the most damaging aspect of all of this is something that I've been exploring now in so many different readers. And I've made a long list of these different, authors, of looking at this denigration of the cultures that are considered to be primitive. And I find this in Jung, I find this in, bizarrely enough, even in Mircea Eliade. To a certain degree, this sense of, and certainly in Huxley, in Aldous Huxley, that the primitive cultures, as they call them, are somehow further down the evolutionary chain. And very briefly, my feeling is that that's completely backwards. And that in fact, as we are entering deeper and deeper into this global crisis, we are realizing that it's the so-called primitive cultures, the indigenous cultures, the First Nations cultures, the traditional cultures, however they're described, who actually hold the keys to our survival, and we don't. And therefore, this is that slightly old imperialist, colonialist narrative that's present that I'm finding real discomfort with. And I'm trying to work my way through it. And there's no better place that I found that exposed than in Darwin's account of the Fuegians in Tierra del Fuego in southern Patagonia. He is so horribly rude about them as being backward, as being under-evolved. And he's incredibly rude. And I found his account of the Fuegians in his Voyage of the Beagle. Obviously, it was in his early days, but it's a deeply, deeply difficult account to read. Because of this denigration of another group of people as being first of all evolutionary backward, but second of all that their fate necessarily has to be one of being civilized by us brilliant white Europeans, and that's, again, it's a very, very difficult narrative to follow.
Thank you very much. Maybe you'd like to respond to that, Jeff, and then we've got a question from Angela, who she'd like to put as well.
Just really quickly, one of my favorite authors there is Bron Taylor, who's a scholar of religion here in the States, and he points out that in Western modernity, the more modern a worldview is, the more things it considers dead. And the more primitive a worldview is, the more things that the worldview considers alive. So in these indigenous cultures, everything is literally alive. And in the modern Western scientific worldview, everything is literally dead. It's just dead matter. So I think you have a real point there. The counterpoint there, Will, would be, there's a lot of conversation among historians of science about whether the origin of science really didn't depend on monotheism and some kind of transcendent deity that provided order and rationality and a way to measure and ultimately measure and understand the natural world, and to consider it dead, frankly, or to consider it other, to consider it not divine, and so somehow contingent. And I think that's a tough question. I don't have an answer for that. I just think it's easy to it's easy to side with one culture over another, but I think it's harder to understand that each culture gives us something that the others don't, and that they may not be compatible at the end of the day.
Thanks very much, Jeff. Angela.
Oh, thanks. Hi, Jeff. It's lovely to see you.
Hi, Angela. Good to see you. You look so blue.
Yeah, I'm very blue at the moment. I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about the question of reflexivity, because so much hangs on what you've written about, the observer observing themselves through a camera, as it were, and standing back and looking at oneself looking, which seems to be the key. And we were talking earlier about the topological sense of scripture, which is that moment of suddenly realizing that you're looking at yourself looking, as it were. And I'm all for bringing the old and the new together. I'm all for finding ways of translating esoteric, maybe more ancient ideas through into the future and into ways which we can understand. And so the connection between that topological turn and the reflexivity that you're talking about, particularly in the Comparing Religions, which I think is such a brilliant textbook for helping people do that. I just wonder what your views would be on, whether this actually can be a retranslation of the old into the new in a very positive way that kind of takes the esoteric out of, the four senses hermeneutic. Oh, that's just an ancient old method, and brings it into this modern reflexive turn of the soul in some way.
Yeah. So of course, Angela, that's what the Comparing Religions textbook is all about, is trying not to be esoteric, right? It's trying to make this argument that by learning to compare one another fairly and profoundly, we'll hold our own worldviews much more lightly, and will identify much more compassionately with other human beings and other human communities. But that move is really hard for people to do. As you know, and as we've seen in our politics on both sides of the pond, people want to assume their own community is right and the other community is wrong. And so there's a basic failure to compare one another in a compassionate and sympathetic way there. And what I was trying to do in the flip is basically say, look, if we do this in a radically enough way through education, people won't understand themselves as this or that primarily. They'll understand themselves as human beings who happen to be this or that, but are not this or that. And I think that's this profound reflexive move that is frankly very rare, unfortunately.
But necessary.
That's really what I think it's about.
Mark, I'm going to hand back to you just to wind up this section.
Yeah, so we're moving into the last sort of section before 4, and there are hands going up, and one I've noticed, I think, is Bernard Carr there. Do you want to ask a question as we move into a freer last 15 minutes or so? And if any speakers from this morning would like to add thoughts, then let us know as well, and this would be a moment to begin to do that. But Bernard.
Yes, thank you. A few points. First of all, I was delighted at the emphasis on Frederick Myers, both in the talks, well, from Jules and William, and also implicitly from Jeff, because and I was also delighted at the reference to Esalen. And the reason I'm saying that is just to announce something which not everybody will know, that Myers, of course, is the hero of myself and the Society of Psychical Research. He founded it. And one of the most prestigious awards the SBR can make is the Myers Memorial Medal. And that was recently made to Ed Kelly, of course, because of the crucial work he did primarily during the meetings at Esalen, which, they've been running these groups in Esalen for many years. This group which sort of seeks the middle way between the polarized fundamentalisms of science and religion and enlarged conception of nature anchored in science and including spiritual realities. And in particular, that led to these classic volumes, Irreducible Mind and Beyond Physicalism, which Ed Kelly was the primary editor. And so I just thought that was a nice way of linking both the talks of Jules and William, and indeed Jeff being the playing such a crucial role in Esalen now. But the real thing, I wanted to take issue with Jeff over 2 points. Obviously, I'm a great admirer of Jeff's work, but there are just a few things I disagreed with. First of all, when you refer to the problems of parapsychology in America, how you could never hire a parapsychology professor, the situation is better in the UK. I mean, after Bob Morris became the cursed professor, we've now had 100 PhDs in parapsychology in the UK, and this is over something like a dozen universities. I mean, it started off mainly being Edinburgh, but now it's spread, and we've got about about 20 people who did PhDs in parapsychology have now got positions in academic departments. So the situation in the UK is much better than it is in America. But the other thing I wanted to, I guess, disagree with about Jeff, and that is, Jeff obviously doesn't share my enthusiasm from a sort of extension of physics, which is going to accommodate these pictures, these phenomena. And so, I mean, after all, part of the day is discussing, I think, if I remember directly, the presence and meaning of higher dimensions of reality. But I mean, actually, that's one topic which is not being discussed. So I just wanted to say that there are a small group of people, including me, who think the best way of having a new paradigm, which is going to accommodate, if you like, spiritual reality, is to invoke the higher dimensions, which literally come out of physics, because physics itself now talks about higher dimensions. And as a lot of people will know, my personal view is that those higher dimensions can also make space for the spiritual realities which we're talking about today. Now, these ideas aren't popular with physics. Most of my physicist colleagues think these ideas are mad. And I think they're not very popular with the humanities for the reasons that, Jeff said, that, how do you get meaning and things like that? I mean, I disagree with that criticism. I think you can make room. But I just want to stress, because really it is literally going beyond Flatland, which is the title of the day. I just thought someone should point out that, there really is a hope that you can make this link between mainstream science and spiritual and religious experience, if you like, by invoking ideas such as higher dimension. And I'm not saying this is right, it might turn out to be wrong, but I just wanted to counteract Jeff's rather negative perspective on that.
Thank you, Bernard.
Bernard, could you just give us a quick indicator of what that might look like? Because I find it confusing, because I always feel that physics, high dimensions, springs out of mathematics, and then I don't know how to make the leap into meaning. But could you is it possible to just say a bit more on that?
Well, yes,
I mean, our meeting coming up in a couple of weeks, which Bernard might like to mention.
Yes, we've got there's a meeting in December, on December the 12th, which is about, which is really hosted by the Society for Psychical Research, which are going to be required to discuss the Galileo Commission report and David on that occasion. I mean, the point is that the idea of using higher dimensions as a domain for occult phenomena, if you like, goes back well before physics. But when physics came along and mathematically the idea of higher dimensions goes back well before the ideas arose in physics. But it's just now in mainstream, the point I'm making now, that it is now respectable to talk about higher dimensions in mainstream physics, and it has a mathematical basis. But the fact that it's part of physics and that it's got a mathematical basis doesn't preclude it being the basis of a broader ontological description of these phenomena. I mean, that doesn't mean he doesn't. I know Jeff is unhappy because he thinks.
Maybe let him come in, Bernard.
Jeff.
Yeah,
No,
thank you.
No, Bernard, I love the hyperdimensional model, and I love what you do. I was simply referring to your. You just described the physics community as thinking you were mad.
Yeah.
That's all I was saying. I was just describing conventional science or conventional humanities. One of my favorite essays of all time was by one of my teachers, Ioan Culianu. It's called A Historian's Toolkit for the Fourth Dimension. If you haven't read it, you must.
Mm.
And it's all about Flatland and the history of religion. So I'm entirely on your side, Bernard, and I apologize if I said something that was misheard, but I don't disagree with you. I love what you do.
Oh no, I just got the impression you said you thought that couldn't be the ultimate explanation because it lacks references to meaning and things like that.
No, I think the hyperdimensional model does give us meaning. I mean, that's a whole nother conversation, but yeah. I was not referring to that model at all.
Okay. Oh, well, that's good news, Jeff, anyway. So.
Okay. Well, thanks very much indeed. We'll just go back, I think, to the order, if we may. John, you've had your hand up for a long time, but I don't know whether your question still relates to what we've been talking about. Sorry, you're muted, John. You're muted. You need to unmute yourself. You're muted.
Here we go. It's back.
Okay, I'll be okay now. Yeah, I wanted to just come back to the earlier this morning about channeling. My own experience of family constellations, which was started by Bert Hellinger, a Catholic priest to the Zulus. He died a couple of years ago, at the age of about 95. I just really wondered whether anybody on the call was had the same sort of experiences of channeling that I've had, much to my surprise as a scientist. I'll just leave it there.
Well, people can put any answers to that in the chat and then be in touch with you. Thank you very much, John. Sarah is next. Sarah, are you there?
Can you unmute Sarah? There we go.
Yeah, there we go.
Hi. Great. Thanks so much. Fabulous day. Jeff, I love your work. I have to say to my colleagues at the University of Kent, I was director of research in the School of Music and Fine Art before they closed it down. And the thing that I'm very grateful for was the redundancy pay, which allowed me to leave the university and gave me time to get on with my own work as a filmmaker. Much of the work I've engaged in is actually, I've spent the last year training as a medium and as a psychic through the College of Psychic Studies here in London. But the point I wanted to make earlier was a little bit about, I think there's a big sense of negativity here today, which is possibly because the dialogue is so limited to the academy, which is your own cosmology, which no one else gives a shit about.
Yeah.
You know,
that's my point.
Exactly, but there is a world outside of the academy that your work, Jeff, engages in very well, particularly around popular culture's engagement with the paranormal. I'm also thinking about the rise of magic and witchcraft in the wider art world, which, you know, is very much to do with a form of animism, which is a form of re-enchantment. The paradigms that you guys are, in a sense, are critiquing, it's almost like you're kind of missing something which really is rising absolutely everywhere, except for the academy.
That's the problem.
Well,
thank you very much.
It's not a problem.
Well,
there's one more comment I'd like to make. I just want to use John Kleino's work on channeling. I was listening to him the other day on a podcast, and I bought his book. It's absolutely beautiful. But he makes this really, really, really beautiful point about channeling throughout culture, throughout history. Actually, it's access to universal mind in Huxley's ideas of universal mind. And that is a fundamentally democratic idea, which is empowering to all of any sentient being. And so my point here is actually, it's also about the sell point of this, because anyone has access to universal mind and everyone is psychic. You know, so
yes,
when
yeah,
you esoteric is over there, It's not. It's available to everyone. Okay, I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any remarks on that, John? I mean, Jeff?
Yeah, sure. Sarah, thank you. I, of course, agree with you. That's why I've spent much of my life with popular culture and filmmakers and channelers and new age people. I agree with you completely. Again, I work behind enemy lines, Sarah, so I'm a bit sensitive to that context, which you have already referred to. But of course, I agree with you. I just hope those popular actors can shift the dials and can change the culture. That's my real hope.
Thank you. We've got another 3 people lined up for questions, which if you can keep your observations reasonably brief, that would be good. Lucinda.
No.
Yep, you're there.
Just muted yourself again. You're still muted, Lucinda. Sorry.
I'm sorry. Yeah, actually, I put my hand up ages ago and the conversation has moved on, so I'll let other people speak, but thank you anyway.
Okay, Lucinda, thanks. Andrew, if you could keep this reasonably brief, because you've had quite a lot of space already.
Oh, okay. Well, I just wanted to come back. I was just really struck by, okay, like to come back to my own research, I bought a book recently from the 70s called Language and Materialism. And the discussion there is about, you know, the materialism of language and theories at the time, which is the 70s. And they were talking about, anyway, one theory put forward in the book is the idea of a creative use of the signifier in order to change basically power dynamics and things like that, right? So I just want to make the point that I wonder if what's needed here is like a kind of a diplomacy between the academy, or between the at least the scientific and the I suppose more esoteric. And Jeffrey was talking about like rhetorical strategies on the behalf of the scientific community and kind of gaslighting strategies and things like that. And I wonder whether on the side of people who are open to the esoteric, whether a kind of a kairos of, you know, a kind of a neutral language might be the way forward. I don't really agree that we should embrace an elitism of esotericism. I think maybe, you know, and I know that Jung was doing this at the end of his life. He was trying to find a neutral language in order to discuss his ideas with the scientific community. I think he realized that a neutral language was the way forward. And I wonder if people would have anything to say about that.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Jeff, what's your view of that?
I'm not sure I understand the question, Andrew. My proposal for the esoteric was really just a kind of psychotherapy to get people to understand why their own families and their own public cultures don't follow them. It's really just to acknowledge our unusual place in public society. And of course I spend most of my life in the public with Esalen, with these popular movements, but I don't see them reflected in American public culture in the same way. Maybe it's a difference between England and the US, I don't know.
I do like your idea of diplomacy, though, of sort of diplomacy between positions, and I think you're in that situation, Jeff.
Yeah, absolutely. That's all. I mean, that's what I thought we were doing. That's what I think this network is about, is that kind of diplomacy. I'm all for it. I just want us to feel better. That's all.
Well, Jeff, if I might just make the point, like you, on one hand, you're talking about popular culture in America, and then you're talking about the academy, and those are two groups that seem to be resistant to the idea. So there's a weird sort of binary there. And then there's the people that embrace the esoteric ideas. And the point that I'm making is that, like, if we could reach some kind of what I call a kairos, like a sort of a synthesis of, and this is the point I was making about the signifier, that I think the signifier, instead of upsetting power relations, could actually be used creatively as a neutral, you know, and I think that's what's needed. I think that there's a neutrality of language which would be creative, because it would invite synthesis.
Thank you. Thank you.
That I get that totally. Sorry about that.
Good. Yes. Well, so I think this whole business of the neutrality of language and you know, speaking across, you know, to be able to communicate, and possibly in simpler language as well, is important. So we've got two people in the queue, and then I think we must wrap up. So Philip, and then John M. So Philip, over to you.
Thank you. Yes, I put my hand up actually just before Bernard Carr spoke, and I'm glad he did, because I wanted to say something rather similar about where science is. I think I'm a medic by training, but I've had time in the last few weeks to really delve into what's available online. There's such a wealth out there, and particularly Sir Roger Penrose, one of the most respected mainstream scientists in the UK and worldwide, even more so since his Nobel Prize a month or two ago. And his view of the coming extension of science, which may well be in the next years and decades, is not in the higher dimensions. He's perfectly at home in the mathematics of higher dimensions, as far as I understand him, but rather in the field of quantum physics. He feels there's something seriously missing or lacking in the way of comprehending there, which, when it becomes thought through appropriately, will really open the way to a scientific access to what consciousness or awareness or our sense of truth might be, how it might be coming through to us, how we might be accessing this. And the last comment on that is one of his collaborators and co-authors, Stuart Hameroff, an anaesthetist, clearly answers in one of these web chats that the two of them speak for an hour each and then answer questions. Clearly, Stuart Hameroff, consciousness or some kind of knowing is primary. And our mental capacities, which he sees as mediated through very small scale structures, the microtubules within neurons and the dendrites, at a kind of quantum coherent level, are what mediates consciousness. But I just want to say that, and for those of you who, like me, have time now, Stuart Penrose is such a rich source of thinking and provocative ideas in science.
Thank you, Philip. Do you want to say anything about that, Jeff?
Well, I just, listen, folks, I'm on your side. I get this. I'm just speaking as a historian here. Myers and his crew were thinking it was right around the corner 120 years ago, and they were wrong. And every religious group I've ever studied all speak of a kairos. They all speak of the worldview that's just about to change. So all I'm trying to do is make you feel better and say, look, folks, let's just acknowledge our own little secret society here and be a little happy about it, and not try to judge ourselves with this stick of the broader society. I think we're always going to be frustrated. And there is a suspicion inside me that what we're talking about is not accessible to everyone, despite that we believe that that's metaphysically true. It's probably actually not psychologically true.
Thank you, Jeff. John, you have the last intervention. John M. You need to unmute yourself.
Yes, I mean, I think it's very interesting what you said. I work in psychiatry, and I suppose my point is that a lot of people do experience something of the esoteric, and in their own way and certain extreme states briefly, perhaps. But I guess just to sort of make a very general point is that how society views certain experiences of the academy, say the academy sets the tone, and there are, okay, in America, I think there's $80 billion a year spent on antipsychotic medication to reduce some resonant experiences, which I'm not saying all of them are in this esoteric domain, but I think there is a lot of pressure from a lot of political, social context sources, and it's normal, obviously, to create a world which is a bit more normal in that sense. I'm not expressing this particularly well, but my point is, I think that's where society in large part is shaped, entirely shaped in this domain I'm talking about. And the point being, I think, is that there's a lot of human potential there. I think that's the point of this whole discussion, really, to connect a little bit more with that, have a bit more openness to what it is that people experience, and to allow people with older ways and understandings to live with it. And rather than, in certain ways, people have an experience which frightens a lot of people, and then it's shut down. And there's a lot of lives that are shut down, and it's complicated, I understand that. But I think this is where this becomes very real, that this attitude of, if you have that experience, there's actually something dramatically wrong with you that needs to be shut down. As even in research, anomalous experiences are not able to be researched, I understand, if there's an overlap with mental illness, so-called.
Thank you very much indeed, John. Would you like a few closing comments with that, Jeff?
David, I think I agree with everything John just said. I think these experiences are often destabilizing, and I think terror is as common as love and compassion here. And I just think we need to take it all in and not make the complex simple. And I think that's what I heard John saying, that these are really complicated things. And I think that's why we should be talking about them more and thinking about them.
Well, thank you so much, Jeff. And I'd like to thank everybody who's been involved today, also behind the scenes with Andrew. I think we've had a very rich conversation, and each of us came this morning in certain state with certain expectations. And I'm certainly speaking for myself, I've got a lot out of the day, and my knowledge of hermeneutics, for instance, has been expanded beyond what it was before. And we've had just people coming in from many very different angles to contribute to the expansion of the field, and the sense that this is an important conversation to have. And that just being here, having the thing, rather than worrying too much about what other people might be thinking of it, or whether it really measures up to academic rigor and so forth. So I'd just like at this point to hand back to Mark for any final reflections, and thank you all very much indeed for being part of today.
Yeah, well, to add my thanks as well. Thanks to Andrew again, who's been working very hard there in the background, holding the whole thing together, and to the Scientific and Medical Network. More generally, it's wonderful to have been able to put on a day initially inspired by one of my teachers, as it were, Owen Barfield. He's been there in the background somewhat. Really great to collaborate as well with Angela Voss, who I had an early conversation with about it. I'm delighted that we were able to think about these hermeneutical tools and the tropological, because it was certainly an insight that was transformative for me, and can, as it were, bring some of this change into everyday consciousness, as much as little synchronicities or something more dramatic may happen as well. Great inspiration for me as well, Plato. He launched a revolution that's called education. He even thought there could be philosopher queens, would you believe it? It did take a few hundred years to gather steam. So we're an urgent 100-year project, as we say at Perspectiva. But thank you very much indeed. Grab your inspiration, hold on to it, work at it. That's, I think, one of the messages for the day for me, because as the divine says, as I quoted that Sufi lovely quote right at the beginning, he's a hidden treasure. That is the esoteric element, but God longs to be known, to be exoteric and in the world as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Mark. And could I just add that, you know, you are our ambassadors for all of these organizations who put today together. So if you've enjoyed it, talk about it to your friends. Come and join us at next week's meetings. Put it up on your Facebook page. You know, become an active part of the community, because I think that it's we who need to be shaping a narrative that can be more widely communicated to the world, because the narratives that we are receiving at the moment are very partial and damaging, and it's only us as, you know, humans really recognizing our depth dimension, in my view, that can, you know, offer something, some nourishing food, you know, because meaning is food, and we're short of meaning, we're short of food, and so we need to be able to nourish ourselves and nourish others at the same time. So thank you very much indeed. And Andrew, I think, is going to unmute us to say goodbye. And Mark, thank you so much for your creative inspiration in putting this and the previous year's conference together. And we look forward to doing something again to continue the conversation, whether virtually or in real life, as it were.
Brilliant.
Thank you very much for a wonderful day.
So much.
You can unmute yourselves now, so feel free to unmute and say thank you and goodbye. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you all.
See you. Thank you. Thanks.
Bye. Thank you. Goodbye.
Wonderful.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.